All right. So our last section is going to be about possible integration solutions. So again, this isn't a definitive list, but we're going to talk about a lot of possible ways that we can, we can advocate for more integration on a personal choice level, on a community level, on a government level, and various different ways that things that we can support and oppose to help further integration. So I'm going to start off first with another Nicole Hannah-Jones video. This interview is about why it's important to tie our fates together in this country, particularly around education.
So we've seen in just the past couple of weeks protests emerging across the country against underfunded public schools, from Oklahoma to Kentucky to West Virginia. And these are protests about not about inequities within the public schools, but about the lack of funding, the lack of teacher salaries, pension issues writ large across the school systems. And these are teachers protesting for every school, every student. At the same time, you're talking about inequities within the public school system. How do you strike that balance? Because it seems like one of the ways in which you can get parents to care more about inequities of the system, or at least take them on, is by making every school better, right? I mean, what is the balance between making the whole system better while solving inequality within the system?
So, one, I think we should understand that the struggles that we're seeing across the country of underfunding of public schools is a direct result of Brown v. Board and the desegregation of schools. As we start to see white Americans having to share educational spaces, you see a withdrawal of support of public education. That is directly linked. Even in places where there are not a lot of Black kids, it is that understanding that once Black children get access to those spaces, and you can look at it in terms of public pools, public parks, public hospitals, any place where after the civil rights movement, Black people gained access, you started to see a loss of support. So these things are directly connected. But that also shows how the fates of all of us are connected, that you can't contain that lack of investment in schools only to Black schools, that it becomes a problem for all Americans, no matter what their colors are, if we decide that public institutions are no longer important. So I think that is the beauty of integration, is that it ties our fates together. We know that from the founding of this country, even before this country, when we decided that Black people were going to be a caste of people who didn't have humanity, who didn't have citizenship, that anytime we have isolated Black people arrest away from those who have power in this country, we have declined to give them the same resources or access as other people. When you tie our fates together, that means you can't deprive a Black child of a textbook, a teacher, like I'm in schools where there's no teacher in the classroom. If your little child is in that class with that Black child too, you will best be sure that if a white child is in that class with that Black child is going to get what that white child always gets. So it's not to say that there aren't struggling schools that are white, because there clearly are. But what it is to say is, if there's a Black school nearby, that Black school will always have less. And that's why we have to tie our fates together. If we are to be truly a multiracial democracy, and the odds are not in white folks' favor anymore, numerically, who's going to pay your Social Security? Who's going to pay for all of the things that we need if we are depriving now 50% of the children born are people of color of a proper education? So, as Malcolm X would say, one day our chickens are going to come home to roost if we continue to pretend that Black and brown children are not as worthy of the same education that white people demand for their children.
I want to hopefully end on an up note. And
you got the wrong person.
I just wanted to include that last little line too as well, because this is a complicated situation, and for sure. But Yeah. It's- all right. So the next slide is just a list of possible integration solutions. It's not a definitive list. There's a lot more things, solutions out there. Everyone's situation is going to be different. Everyone's school system is going to be different, and it's going to have its own nuances. So you need to, not all of these are going to fit. You need to do your own research. You need to figure out, your own, choices and how that affects communities and how that affects integration and segregation, for sure. But this is just a bunch of stuff I found and just throughout my own personal research. So I'm just going to go through this list really quickly. And the first one is, as I said, just do your own research. I mean, some people, don't have, much of a school choice, but, other people have tons of choices for which school to send their kids in. So you need to do the research, about, which choices make the best, or best for the community, which ones are increasing integration, which ones are increasing segregation and inequalities. There's probably a lot of local organizations that have done research already, or maybe some great articles that have, researched this stuff. And it's a lot, to ask, because it's a lot to research, just how to navigate some of these school systems. Like DC school system's insane. It takes an enormous amount of time just to figure out how it even works. So I understand, but we need to, take that, that extra mile and not only research how these systems work, but also what are the best decisions based on integration. And this is a really great website to help you get started. It's called Miseducation. We talked about it earlier. It's a ProPublica site where they analyze thousands of schools and figured out which ones are doing good and which ones are doing bad when it comes to segregation and integration and racial inequities. So definitely check out, look at all your schools. I guarantee you, most of your schools are going to be in that website. Check them out and check out which ones are doing the most, good and the least good for the not just for your individual segregated community, but also for the entire, your entire community, entire school district. The next one is just advocate for integration policies and politicians. So become an advocate for this stuff, and this isn't just this isn't this is a full-time thing. Talk about research your personal choices, talk about your choices and when your social circles, talk about them with your friends and family, let them know why integration should be a priority when you pick which school you're applying for. Talk about in community meetings, especially if you have community meetings that are talking about rezoning times are the best times to push new integration plans. We talked about the Montgomery County rezoning. They were just going to rezone just because they're what majority white rich schools were becoming overcrowded, so they're just going to rezone just to kind of deal with that. And there was one parent that advocated for an integration plan and talked about how segregated the schools were, and then that led to a further analysis which found that the school Montgomery County was in Maryland was extremely segregated, and then ultimately led to an integration plan. So you don't have to be a school board or member, a politician. I mean, you can advocate for this stuff, just by being at these community meetings, and then vote for every election. You're going to have a chance to vote for school board school board members, politicians that have certain views on public schools versus charter schools, school choice. This is a very political thing. So a lot of people lay out their views pretty well. So do that research and really fight for the integration policies and politicians as much as possible, and realize that there's they sell a lot of choices to out there to try to try to fix this inequality in our school systems, and understand that like Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about, even though there's all these like choices, like, charter schools and magnet schools and private schools and all these things that have tried to kind of fix the inequalities in our school systems to a certain degree, there's only been one strategy that's really fixed, inequalities in our school systems. That's really fixed, and fixed it very effectively. And that was integration mainly throughout the 70s and 80s. They were hugely successful, even though we teach that, especially busing wasn't, but it actually was. Black students, have never benefited more from schools and during those, integration, that time period. So it's important to understand, like, like literally, when you say, oh, well, I just want more funding for a Black school, or I just want to build another Black school, do that, like for sure, I'm for that. Let's build nice schools in Black neighborhoods. Let's bring funding. And let's also realize that's actually, what Plessy first Ferguson is talking, the that's a separate but equal doctrine, which has been proved unconstitutional by Brown versus Board. And the reason why it's unconstitutional is because regardless, even if you think you could fund Black schools equally and build, equally nice Black schools in Black neighborhoods, I know, ultimately that is just not possible in this society, in this white supremacy society. So ultimately, Nicole Hennick Jones talks about, like, she spent 10 years trying to find one school district where the Black school was better than the white school, and she couldn't find it. And that's what ultimately what this leads, this separate but equal doctrine leads to. So yes, fight for, that stuff, but also, fight for integration plans, fight for ways where you can actually, pair that new Black school with a nice white school, can actually start integrating these schools together. Because the only way that Black kids are going to, white people are going to, value and care about Black kids' educations is when their white kids are, fate is wrapped up with Black kids' fate. I mean, when we mix these, these kids and integrate them into schools, that's the only way that we can ensure that white people and white communities and are going to properly fund a Black, child's education. So, yeah, integration is the best way we can do this. When choosing a school, there's this concept we're going to talk about in a second called interest conversion. It's this idea that, white people or just people in general don't typically want to do something unless they benefit as well. It's like mutual benefits. They talk about this in the Nice White Parents podcast. They talk about it in a kind of negative way, but they still, the outcome was still positive, but it was basically in this really segregated New York City school district. There was, all the white parents were fine, with the segregation because they were getting into the best schools, while the Black and brown kids were struggling in these really bad underfunded schools. But it wasn't until those majority white schools started filling up and started getting overcrowded. All of a sudden, white parents were competing against each other and they couldn't all get into these schools. So all of a sudden, it was this madness of trying to like work these systems and getting favors and all this stuff. And ultimately, it led a lot of white parents to start supporting this integration plan. And that they would never have supported that if they could have continued their own segregation and continued the best benefiting their own child. So it's important to understand, like that's we need that mutual benefit, even though that's a bad that's a negative that eventually became a positive. But also there's also mutual benefits. There's also interest conversion, more positive interest conversion, such as just like understanding the benefits of integration. Prioritize the benefits. Instead of don't instead of putting test scores or after school programs, uniforms, things like that as the top priority. Make giving your child a diverse experience with multiple social, economic, and racial and cultural students that they can have experiences with. There's mountains of data that show that not only do white students aren't harmed from integration, like their test scores aren't harmed, their achievement isn't harmed, they actually benefit in lots of different ways. One of them being they become more critical thinkers, because instead of being a critical thinker in your own silo at these white segregated schools, they're actually introduced to all kinds of ideas and perspectives, and that not only makes them a better critical thinker, but it also prepares them better for the real world, prepares them better for this diverse world. They will be more hireable with the skills and the experiences they gather at these schools, as opposed to like test scores and school programs, after school. These are all things that we can provide in addition to these schools. We can send kids to after school sports. We can get tutors. We can get music lessons, things like that. But you're not going to be able to replicate a integrated school experience. That's just not. You're never going to. That's such an important thing that your kid could have. That that is, and can't be replicable, as like as easy as just getting a school, a tutor, or getting, sending your kids to music class because there's no music class, music, out non-school music class because there's no music class in that school. So just make integration a priority. It's a natural interest conversion. Your kid will benefit more from having that integrated experience, and support public schools as much as possible. There are a lot of problems with public schools. Definitely, we need reforms for public schools. It's not a perfect system, but it's a base layer that's important. There's the foundation of public schools. Are super important. That foundation that they're dedicated to teaching every single kid. They're here to protect civil rights and of all children, to protect against discrimination, things like that. Charter schools and private schools, they don't have that same foundation. Many of them don't have the same regulations, don't have to follow the same civil rights, measures, and oftentimes, they'll cream it from the crop. They'll take the best kids from a certain, from a Black neighborhood. Yes, we're giving a handful of Black kids that are testing really well. They'll grab those kids, and those kids will have, possibly have a better, chance. But what happens is, one, you're taking the best testers from that school, so that's going to harm that school. And two, they're taking that funding with them. So public schools are already, underfunded. But what we're doing with charter schools and private schools is we're defunding them even more. So the kids that are left behind that can't get into the multiple barriers to get into these charter and private schools, we're basically leaving them in the worst situation. Instead of creating an integrated situation where we can, with public schools, we're basically creating a segregated experience by sending the best kids to these charter schools while defunding our public schools. And then when you look at the overall rankings, charter schools are actually doing worse than public schools. Many private schools, there are some that are doing better, but overall, you're not getting a better education with these schools. So it's important, let's support public, school systems as much as possible. And in everyone's situation is different. I mean, there may be some situation for a charter school is your best option, but if possible, try look into public schools first. Also support school levies, even if your kids decided you want to go to charter schools. Don't be that person that's like, my kid's not in this public school, I don't need to fund it. These are not big taxes. Especially compared when you look at how much you give to corporate subsidies every year. This is like pennies, which is insane that we don't get to vote on corporate subsidies. We don't get to vote on an $800 million military budget, $1 billion military budget. We don't get to vote all these things. We don't get to vote on, but the only thing we can vote on is whether we want to fund public schools or not, which is insane. Always vote for a school levy, even if your kids aren't in there. It's so important, because we're going to have to pay, if your kids in your community are getting a bad education, you're going to have to pay much more in the long run to support those kids, whether, prison, whether, social services, all different kinds of things. So as opposed to if we give them a decent education, they're actually going to be a productive member that's actually going to contribute to our economy and create jobs. It's so important. Just always, vote yes for public school levies. And then when you're in a school, there's a lot you can do as well. There's a lot of anti-racism policies we can push to make our schools even more, integrated. Because a lot of times, even diverse schools aren't integrated. They have these different academic paths, and they have gifted and talented programs. Where white kids, are more likely to get into based on the barriers that are happening. And then what happens is you have these diverse schools that are actually very segregated when you look in the inside. So there's a lot of things that you can do, to kind of help that. One is like admissions, making sure there's, remove unfair barriers to admissions. Definitely, especially test scores that are racially biased. Gifted programs. Instead of like having a white teacher identify which kids should go, test everyone in that classroom and give everyone an equal chance to the gifted programs. Remove these barriers. Reserve seats in your school for poor kids, for ESL kids, for diversity. Hire teachers. A majority of teachers in this country are white, and the majority of them have, and all white people have that bias, no matter how woke you are. There's training and stuff you can help with, but there's this is why there's a school to prison pipeline. This is why Black and brown children are treated differently. So try to hire as many teachers of color, support that, push policies for in the hiring practices, like maybe in the hiring practices they're there's a lot of ways you can make hiring practices more equitable. Definitely advocate for that. Advocate for more teachers of color. And then the white teachers that you have, offer bias training. Advocate. Go to school, these PTA meetings, and ask your schools to provide, anti-bias trainings and anti-racism trainings. Create an equity team that analyzes schools and does surveys and tries to figure out better ways to implement things like restorative justice programs and things like that. And work on curriculum, anti-racist curriculum. Have racism surveys and outlets where kids that are experiencing any kind of racism can actually have an outlet for that and actually let people know that's happening. Restorative justice programs. We're going to talk a lot about that in our in the policing class, but that's basically a way where instead of using punitive measures, which we know we crack down harder on Black kids for the same infractions. So instead of doing that, involving the police and getting people stuck in the school to prison pipeline, really work on restorative justice is about a healing process where we actually make the wrongs right through mutual agreements and healing and things like that. It's really powerful program. Support school funding reforms. It's insane that we fund our schools by property taxes. We're like the only country that does that, from my understanding. It's just the most unequal, horrible thing, especially in the country that's got centuries of wealth that was accrued through white supremacy and through racial hierarchy and things like that. And then to now say after a decade, a century, a half century of redlining, to now say that we're just going to keep our funds in our local communities. It's crazy. It's so wrong. Any kind of reform that you can have. Ideally, you want to kind of rezone your schools to larger zoning, so that way property taxes can be collected from multiple neighborhoods, and then it can be distributed equally to different school districts. So try to find ways that you can advocate to collect property, you to collect these taxes and have them evenly distributed, instead of having rich neighborhood, rich school, poor neighborhood, poor school. Rezoning is one of the best things that is such a great chance to pass these integration plans and equity plans, because a lot of times it's because of school zoning that things are so messed up. So having a rezoning committee, that's a perfect time to go and just advocate. Let's do studies, let's research our segregation levels, and let's figure out plans to deal with that. And like I said, one of the best things to do is just create larger school districts as much as possible. Get away from this localized kind of thing. Like the larger the school district, the more the more they can do with integrating schools and with giving equal funding to schools and things like that. Or just having, or if you have to rezone, create integration plans, figure out ways to rezone. So it's based on integration, not based on, the richest schools are overcrowding. Let's just figure out a place to put those kids. Then it's like, let's figure out how to integrate the rich schools and poor schools. School pairing is one of the best things you could do. Taking like a rich white school and a black poor school and just pair them together, basically create one school where all the kids participate in both of those schools, and they share equal funding. It's an amazing way for integration. But bottom line, a lot of this, segregation occurs from residential segregation. So a great way to try to, work on school segregation is opposed residential segregation. For example, in DC, we have this school choice plan where, you have a really great chance of getting into your residential, your local neighborhood school. And then it's not very good chances of getting outside schools. It's a lottery system, but you're almost guaranteed a spot in your neighborhood school. So that means, DC is very segregated. We have really rich white neighborhoods and really poor black neighborhoods. So that means, all the black kids are guaranteed a spot at this underfunded school, and all the white kids are guaranteed a spot in the over, funded school. So it's, we got we have to get rid of this racial segregation. There's a lot of things you could do, particularly like learn about modern housing discrimination. A big one, single family zoning. That's a big one in DC, and how we use, to keep, black people and poor people out of these rich white neighborhoods, is that we zone them as single family, saying that you can only build a single family unit, because affordable housing or cheaper housing is multifamily units, like apartment complexes and things like that. So if you're trying to integrate people, you want to spread, affordable housing around and give people a chance to go into these like nice communities where they can participate in the nice schools and hospitals and things. But the problem is we put all of our affordable housing, we concentrate it into poor black neighborhoods, which sounds at first like, oh, that's, it sounds, it's a poor community, they need that affordable housing. But what we're doing is we're concentrating poverty into that area. What you want affordable housing, that you want it to be decentralized across across the district, so poor people have a chance to actually participate and moderate to middle class to upper class neighborhood resources, instead of all of the poor people fighting for a small amount of resources. So oppose that single family zoning, work with, there's a lot of organizations working with gentrification, find those organizations, help out, with zoning commissions and fair budgets, votes and council hearings and things like that. It's important, to get involved with, you don't need to figure all this out yourself. Just find the local organizations that's doing it, and find ways to support those local organizations. Particularly, it's also with like support affordable housing, tenant rights, fair, tenant rights, not just like with renters' rights, but also eviction rights as well. Right to councils, things like that. We're going to talk a lot about that in the affordable housing and gentrification class. Fair budgets. Making sure your community is investing just as much, if not more, in the poor communities as they are in the rich white communities. And ultimately, this is going to be a while off, but we need reparations. If you really look at our history, we have an insane amount of wealth that was accrued through racial hierarchy and white supremacy, through things like redlining, and the GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration, and all these things that ultimately led and created this country where at this point in our history, white people have the majority of the money. They have the majority of money not because they worked harder. They have 16 times more wealth than black people, not because of a meritocracy, but because of a white supremacy society. I saw this one thing, quote, I'm going to mess it up, but it talked about how you didn't just make good decisions, you had good decisions. Most people don't have those decisions. So yes, you worked hard, but you had the chance to work hard, and a lot of people don't even have that. So we need reparations. We need to fix past harms. So all right, so I want to talk about another strategy This one's a bigger strategy for sure. This one's a long-term strategy, but this idea of consolidating school districts into these large school districts where you can regulate things. You collect all the property taxes and distribute it exactly how equally to all schools, where you can make decisions on how to integrate across huge lines, that can include, inner city schools, but also include, suburb schools as well. Like the plan that Detroit tried to pass a while ago that we talked about. So I want to I'm going to play a quick, clip of Nicole Hannah-Jones talking about this, but I also want to talk about read this article, this quote from Claire Lombardo, who wrote "Why School Districts Have So Much Money." She wrote, according to EdBuild researchers, predominantly white districts are often smaller than districts with mostly students of color. The former serves an average of just over 1,500 students and the latter over 10,000, or 3 times the national average. That size disparity matters. Districts serving mostly students of color rely more on decisions that are being made at the state level, but there are fewer voices representing them. And that's where you really see the shift in power. The power dynamic looks different in the South, where school district lines are often drawn along county lines, making districts larger across the board. Researchers found that funding looks more equal in states like Georgia and Alabama. This confirms the theory that we've had, which is that the larger the tax base, the larger the actual geography of the school district, the more you can actually balance out the difference between wealthy white suburbs and a less wealthy rural or urban area. So I'm going to play just a quick little speech from Nicole Hannah-Jones talking more about this.
What can you do about that? It's very easy and also the hardest thing in the world. You have to stop funding school systems by local property tax. We are one of the only countries in the world that does this. And you have to consolidate school districts. So one of the reasons school desegregation was so successful in the South was most school districts in the South are countywide, which means they include the city, the suburbs, and rural areas all in one school district. You couldn't simply move 5 miles up the road and avoid desegregation and move into an all-white school district, because no matter where you lived in the county, you all attended the same school district. In the North, as you know, you can have 30 school districts in one county. Each one has its own attendance zone, sets its own policy, has its own taxing system. You need to consolidate those. That takes away a lot of those property issues and those taxing issues. That's the easy thing to do. It is also the thing that is going to be nearly impossible to do. And the only ways wealthy white communities are never going to voluntarily vote to give that up. Matter of fact, what do you hear people say? I moved here to get access to these types of schools. And if I wanted to share my schools with them, I wouldn't live here. So the only way that you can really do that is by court order, or if the governor decides to consolidate school districts on its own. This is something that folks can advocate for, but what I find is when I bring this up to white liberals who are looking for solutions, all of a sudden their eyes start glazing over and they're like, hell no. So I don't know.
Okay, sorry, in that a little bit of a sour note, but I mean it is a big, heavy lift. It's something that's going to, you're going to need a lot of partners and a lot of advocates, but it is something to start working towards as well, because we know that it's been proven that to be able to create equal school districts, across, huge areas of land. It's the best solution to actually equalize the really nice suburb schools, well-funded white suburb schools with the, city and rural, poor schools. So I want to take one more podcast break. These are going to be some short clips, so each one of these is like anywhere from like 3 to 5 minute long. So it's just going to be 3 little sections, just kind of give you a little bit more about think about like possible solutions and things like that. The first one is going to be about this. It's about this woman, Miriam. She's like a civil rights lawyer that she actually helps start this really great new integrated school. But she had a really great quote that I just wanted to capture. But I definitely, listen to the whole 3 minutes in her stories, for the context. But she writes, white parents, or like this is from the narrator of Nice White Parents. White parents get to be individuals making rational, thoughtful choices. We aren't forced to consider all the ways we act as a group. So for a long time, Miriam didn't. Even though Miriam is a civil rights lawyer, even though she created a school and knew the way middle school admissions work better than most people do, even though she was part of the public school system, she couldn't see what was right in front of her until the word segregation was lifted out in 1950s Alabama and stamped onto her life. And then she could see. And that's really important because, I mean, when we talk about it talks a lot about Mayor de Blasio, who just refuses to say the word segregation. He says like racial imbalances and residential imbalances and things like that. But he won't say segregation. And that, at first when I thought that, I was just like, oh, that's just a preference. But I mean, that's very intentional because there's a lot of power behind that word segregation. There's a whole, chapter in our history textbooks around Jim Crow that paints that word on exactly, the impacts that it does have. So that's why we watered down this stuff with like school choice and, all these other things. But when we actually bring the word segregation out, that's a powerful word. So it's important to use that word as much as possible to actually describe what we're talking about. And then definitely check out this section. This is between 40 and 45. It's 5 minutes long, but it's they've been talking about this school for a while in this podcast, but it's really great school. Basically coming up with an integration plan. It's a really cool integration plan. They talk a lot about it from, they won't screen kids anymore for test scores or attendance, or being nice, which they talked about. Literally, there was a school that's like, we're just looking for nice kids as they're like screening for admissions, which, imagine, a bunch of white parents, or white people looking for, quote, nice kids. There's a huge racial bias on that. They got rid of all that. They had middle school admissions would proceed by lottery. And then like every parent would still get ranked choice, but every school would require to offer over 50% of the seats to kids with poor, speak English, ESL kids or living in temporary houses. So these are kids that usually have a lot of barriers that can't get into these nice schools. So they're actually offering, reserving seats for these kids. And then in addition to that, they have all kinds of anti-racism and anti-bias trainings for the administrators, staff, even parents, which I thought was really cool. And then they have equity teams and all kinds of like culturally responsive curriculum. So definitely check it out. It's really, really cool. But I like this idea down here. It says, instead of trying to solve their individual problems, the woman from, it's called Parents for Middle School Equity, focus all their attention on the school system that created those problems, on all solutions that would benefit all kids. Because that's oftentimes when we reach these unequal systems, especially when it's our kids, we look for ways to benefit just our kids. Well, let me get, a letter from this high up contact or from, a school board member or something, and let me pull whatever strings I have to kind of work it, or let me play the system, apply to every school, figure out something, thing that's going to benefit me. But instead of doing that, these parents actually, they realized how messed up their system was, and they actually, created a new system that worked for everyone. And that's really how we need to approach these things. It's not so much, how can I, benefit from the system, but we need how can we create a system that actually benefits everyone equally. And it's really, I really love this last line. I had to put it in. This is from the narrator. Because some of the opposition to these integration plans is that some of these white parents who are like, oh well, my kid tests better, or has a better attendance record than some of these poor kids. So what are we saying when we're saying that these kids that goofed off or whatever, or didn't take education seriously, should the parents like, should they have the same education as my kid that's tried really hard? And I know, it doesn't, you can have these gut reactions when you hear that, but ultimately, the answer, according to our Constitution, according to Brown versus Board, is yes. And so she writes that, I do believe that a 9-year-old who messed around in 3rd grade is still entitled to the same opportunity in a public school as a 9-year-old who stayed in her seat. I think this is what it means when we say each child is entitled to an equal public education. So regardless of your past experiences, regardless of what everyone is still entitled to an equal education. And that's a hard thing to support, but that's what it means for educational equality. And then the last part I have, we already talked a little bit about this, but interest conversion. They talk about, they have a really great example. So it was like the school that was basically, school system. All the white parents were fine when they were still getting into these nice schools, these nice white segregated schools. But as soon as schools filled up, got overcrowded, and then they suddenly had to fight, for whatever was left. Suddenly you have this huge group of white parents who wanted to reform the system and started supporting integration plans. So, I just want to read this definition of interest conversion. A legal scholar and civil rights advocate named Derek Bell came up with this term, interest convergence. He believed that the only times we ever see an expansion of rights for Black Americans is when white Americans benefit, when interest converges. If white Americans don't see something in it for themselves, nothing changes. All right, so I want to leave this because I know that was a lot, of information, but I want to kind of leave this. Nicole Hannah-Jones, I think it was like kind of a motivational speech of how that, of we can do this, I'm just gonna, it's a good, I'm going to end the presentation on this speech. So, yeah. All right.
Choose to undo it. One of the things that I've heard a lot in my work is I wrote about my own daughter. I did a piece about choosing a school for my daughter in New York City because I had written about school segregation for many years, most of the time without having a child of my own. And I can tell you, many of you don't have children, but one day maybe you will. It's much easier to have your values when you don't have to live them. I had a lot of values, and I think many of the people in this room had values until they were confronted with actually not having them as an abstraction, but having to make choices that lived up to those values. And so I covered school segregation, and I remember thinking about how hypocritical so many of the people who said they were advocates for justice were, because while they would say they were fighting for Black kids and poor kids, when you'd ask them where they sent their kids to school, they weren't sending their kids to school with those kids that they said they were fighting for. They were fighting for those kids over there. And so I told myself way back when I was a young reporter that when the time came for me, I was not going to be like them. But I also didn't think I would end up in New York City, one of the most segregated, unequal school systems in the country. I live in a poor Black neighborhood with poor Black schools. I had managed to avoid school segregation myself. I was bused to white schools starting in the 2nd grade. My husband was a military brat. Uncle Sam doesn't play that, so he never attended a segregated school a day in his life because base schools are integrated. And here I was having to decide what I was going to do with my child. And I decided, then told my husband my decision, because that's basically how these things go, that we were going to enroll our daughter in the school with kids like the kids that we have in our neighborhood. That we were not going to use our privilege to take her away from kids who are like our family members. That we could not say that segregation was wrong and then partake in a system that privileges white children and privileges middle class and upper middle class children. So I wrote about it because I understood that this decision is very hard. It's probably nothing that scares people more. You guys probably know with your own parents than trying to ensure that your children will have the best possible chance in life. And I spent all these years writing about how segregation hurt Black kids, and here I was deciding I was going to put my child in that school. But I also believe that if each of us says we believe in equality, but then makes decisions that uphold inequality, the system doesn't change. And one of the things that I heard from parents was, how dare you sacrifice your child? How dare you put your child in a school like that? You don't have the right to experiment with her for some belief that you have. And so as I get ready to close out my speech, I want us all to think about the question that I asked back to every person who said that to me. Whose children are worthy of sacrifice? If we're going to continue to uphold schools, if we know that there are schools near us that we wouldn't dare send our children to, whose children deserve to be in those schools then? And it's not enough to say, oh, it's really sad for them. Because whether you believe it or not, then you are upholding that system. And every parent who decides not to uphold that system is working for justice. And every parent who makes a different decision, you can't claim that you're working for justice. Because there's a very easy mathematical calculation. And I am a journalist, so I'm not good at math. But you can't have equality while taking advantage for your own kids. It doesn't work that way. Equality means the opportunity that my child gets is the opportunity that your child gets. And maybe that means that my child doesn't go to a school with 24 advanced placement courses. Maybe my child goes to school with 12, so that the other school can have 12. Doesn't really seem like that much to give up. So I'm going to tell you about the young lady whose slide I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. Because I think we always need to come back to understanding that all these abstractions are actually about real children and their lives in a country that says that education is the great equalizer. This young lady's name is Delisha. I met her when I was writing about resegregation in the South. I fell in love with her the first time I met her because she has these huge dimples. And she always had a smile on her face. And she was the type of girl where if she wasn't a poor Black girl with a name like Delisha with an apostrophe in her name, we would call her an All-American girl. But we never, ever called girls like her an All-American girl. Delisha was a state champion track athlete. She was an honor student. She was class president. She was on the mayor's youth council. She did everything that we tell kids to do if they want to be successful. But Delisha was born into a town that had decided to resegregate its schools, and she attended from kindergarten through 12th grade, schools that were entirely Black and where 90+% of kids lived in poverty. The same types of schools that her grandfather had attended for 13 years when he was a child. It didn't matter to Delisha because it's the only types of schools that she ever knew. And she was a good student. So she didn't realize what she was not getting until she went to take her ACT prep class. And she took that class with white kids from across town at the integrated high school. And in all the months I'd been following her, that was the first time I saw her confidence shaken. She came back and she said, "Miss Nicole, they knew so many things that I didn't know." But she was like, "I'll just study and I'll be okay." Because, you know, when it comes to poor Black kids, all we talk about is resilience. We don't expect everybody else's kids to overcome every obstacle, but somehow this is what Black kids are supposed to do to succeed. So she studied and she tried her best and she took her ACT. And the first time she took it, she got a 16. Now, you college students know what that means if you want to get into any decent college in this country. So she took it again and she got the same score. And she would come home every day while most kids your age and her age who had done all of the things that she did would come home and their mailboxes would be brimming with letters from colleges who were courting them. She would come, and if she was lucky, there would be a recruitment letter from the Army or the Navy, because that's the expectation for kids who are poor and Black going to poor Black high schools who get a 16 on their ACT. So she took it a third time, and she got another 16. And at that point, I said, "Are you going to take it again?" And she was like, "No, Miss Nicole, why would I take it again? I'm never going to be able to learn enough to get a high enough score." So at 17 years old is when she realized that she had not been educated. She had dreamed of going to the University of Alabama. So those stadium lights back there are the famous Tuscaloosa Stadium, Crimson Tide. Her school was a few blocks from that program. All the professors live around her school, but their kids are bused to the integrated public high school and away from the school that's in their neighborhood. And she had dreamed that she would go to that school because, well, y'all might know this, but they're kind of crazy about University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And she had told me how she imagined that this would be the first time she would ever sit in an integrated classroom. That she was looking forward to studying Shakespeare with kids who were Latino and Asian, and not just going to school with kids all the time who were just like her. That she wanted to have discussions, that she wanted to be able to see the world from a different perspective. But you can't get into the University of Alabama with a 16. It It doesn't matter what your grade point is. And the University of Alabama also knows that her high school is a low-performing high school. Because while the white high school had approximately 15 advanced placement courses, her high school had none. Her high school didn't offer physics. It didn't have a newspaper or a yearbook or any of the things that we expect out of our high school. So we told her what she needed to do to succeed, but we didn't live up to our end of the deal. And Alicia didn't give up. She's not the type of girl to give up. She ended up getting into Miles College, which is a historically Black college in Birmingham. She's graduating this May. She was determined. And I support historically Black colleges. I feel like they are important and they play a critical role, but that was not what she wanted. And if it's not what she wanted, then it's more than she deserved. So when we ask the question, whose children are worthy of the sacrifice, we already know the answer, because the same children we've always sacrificed in this country. And now we have a crop of other students, because during the time of Brown, the Latino population in this country was quite small. But as we've seen that population rise, we've seen that they are also being treated in much the way that Black Americans have been treated. And they are also being segregated away from opportunity. So if we think about Martin Luther King, we wrap this up about why we're even here today. I know our favorite thing about Martin Luther King is I Have a Dream. One, most of us have never read that whole speech either, because I Have a Dream is a very small part of that speech. He actually talks about the check that was returned on America marked insufficient funds because of the promises that America had broken to Black people. But we somehow, that's not a great soundbite for our McDonald's commercials. And Dr. King did not die in 1963. He lived for 5 more years. And his speeches became increasingly more radical over those 5 years. This is a quote from a speech where he asked, "Where do we go from here, chaos or community?" This speech was given a few months before he was assassinated. At this point in time, he had lost a great deal of his white support. White support had gone down about 25 percentage points in 4 years. The majority of white Americans were at that point opposed to him. And then, of course, one white American killed him. But what he says is there's never been a commitment on the majority of white Americans for genuine equality for Negroes. This is not the King that you get in your history class. He says there's always been ambivalence. And when we talk about where do we go from here, we have to honestly face that in order for us to address this inequality, it calls for a fundamental restructuring of our whole society. There are no easy fixes. There are no ways to fix these problems without giving up any of the unearned advantage that you may have had in a country built on racial caste. The whole structure must change. And then he says there's no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. Because we all come to these convocations because we like to imagine, had we been alive back then, some of us were alive back then, but I won't call y'all out. We like to imagine we would have been on the right side of things. And it's very easy, 50 years removed, to say we would have been on the right side of things. To say we would have marched with King and we would have supported, and how appalling it was that they fought what he was trying to do. But then we have to look at what side are you on right now? Because the side you're on right now is the side you would have been on back then. If you're not working to fundamentally restructure our unequal society, if you're simply coasting along and accepting the benefits, if you fight any efforts to integrate schools, to bring about more equality, for whatever reasons you tell yourselves, you would have done that back then too. And you don't really get to claim his legacy. Because his legacy one was a radical change of saying are we finally going to treat all Americans as full citizens? Because it's not enough to hope for a better day. I don't know who I stole this from, So don't try to say I plagiarized it. I'm giving credit, I just don't know to whom. Hope is an action. I'm not, a religious person, but I know the Bible says faith without works is dead. So to simply say I have hope that one day the world will be better without taking any action to make it so, and there's a very simple action you can make if you have children, if you one day will have children, is to put your children in the schools with the kids that other people don't want to put their children in schools with. Then accept that you actually don't want equality if you can't do those things. Because my daughter has not been harmed a bit by being in a classroom with other kids who happen to be Black and happen to be poor. And trust me when I say, my daughter has benefited as much from being in that school as I would ever hope those kids would benefit from her having her in the classroom. Because she's learned. Having things doesn't make you smart. Having things doesn't make you a good person. You can be poor and have just as much to offer clearly as anyone else. And these things seem like they make sense and that they're clear, but they're not. Because we uphold segregation because we fear our children. And we fear for our children. And so we decide that we will uphold the system. So go home tonight, look in your mirror, and ask yourself really, what side are you on? Do you believe all of our children deserve equality or not? Do you believe your children deserve more than other children or not? And if you do, own it. Don't come hear me speak anymore, though. Hope is an action. Take an action. In a small community like this, change can be very easy and transformative. Leave here and try to be better than you were today. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. So the last slide is just a further reading slide. So I have a lot of different articles and resources that I put together in this from the equal. I felt like the early part of the Jim Crow, the de jure segregation, was definitely relied heavily on Equal Justice Initiative reports, segregation in America particularly, and then the de facto school segregation, school choice segregation, relied heavily on Nicole Hannah-Jones. But there's also a lot of other great articles, podcasts as well. And thank you all so much. Yeah, so next week is next class is about housing and banking discrimination. So hopefully I'll get that out in the next month or so. Thanks.